If it's Wednesday, Biden speaks as Putin mobilizes 300,000 more troops. President Biden delivers a blistering attack on Russia's war in Ukraine at today's UN General Assembly, as a struggling Vladimir Putin is now threatening a nuclear confrontation. Plus, New York's Attorney General announces a sweeping civil lawsuit against Donald Trump and his family, alleging wide-scale fraud at the Trump Organization. All of it less than 7 weeks before Election Day. And the latest move by the Fed to fight soaring inflation. The central bank raises interest rates for the 5th time this year, 3/4 of a point. The Fed chair, Jay Powell, tells reporters he's not sure if a significant recession can be avoided to stop inflation. Happy Wednesday and welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Chuck Todd in New York City, where earlier today here, President Biden was confronting Vladimir Putin's drastic new actions and harsh new rhetoric as Ukraine continues to regain territory in its counteroffensive and Russia becomes more desperate in its efforts not to lose this war. In his address to world leaders gathered at the UN General Assembly earlier today, the president accused Russia of violating the body's core principles, and he criticized Putin, who hours earlier once again saber-rattled about nukes.
Just today, President Putin has made overt nuclear threats against Europe and a reckless disregard for the responsibilities of the non-proliferation regime. Now, Russia's calling up more soldiers to join the fight, and the Kremlin is organizing a sham referenda to try to annex parts of Ukraine, an extremely significant violation of the UN Charter. This world should see these outrageous acts for what they are.
The president also acknowledged the devastating toll the war has already had on Ukraine.
Mass graves uncovered in Izium, bodies, according to those who excavated those bodies, showing signs of torture. This war is about extinguishing Ukraine's right to exist as a state, plain and simple, and Ukraine's right to exist as a people. Whoever you are, wherever you live, whatever you believe, that should make your blood run cold. The United States wants this war to end on just terms, on terms we all signed up for, that you cannot seize a nation's territory by force.
Today's speech also came just hours after Putin announced he was mobilizing some 300,000 additional Russian military reservists, and he dangled the possibility of a nuclear response to defend what he claims is his country's territorial integrity. Of course, what he's claiming is his territory is not. Now, we are expecting Ukraine's President Zelensky to address the UN General Assembly virtually later this hour. We're going to keep a close eye on those remarks. It will be his first public response, if you will, to Putin since that threat to mobilize more troops. And it comes as Zelensky continues to call for more assistance from U.S. and European allies. One of those European leaders is German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. In his first address to the UN's General Assembly as a world leader late yesterday, he demanded that Putin acknowledge Russia cannot win the war and give up his, quote, imperial ambitions. And in an exclusive interview with me today, earlier here in New York, Scholz reacted to Putin's latest actions and threats.
Putin is always very dangerous. He started a brutal war against his neighbor, the Ukraine, with no reason, just for conquering parts of the territory or the whole country. But he did not calculate that there would be that much resistance from the Ukrainians, and that there would be this unity and solidarity of so many friends of the Ukraine to deliver the support they need with financial means, humanitarian aid, and also weapons. And so they were able to spoil all the plans of Putin he had for Ukraine. And now he is desperate and taking decisions that are escalating. But I'm sure this will not help him. He will not win the war.
I've got a lot more of my exclusive sit-down coming up both this hour and later this week, including what the Chancellor had to say about the looming energy crisis that's been created by this war and how his country is preparing as winter is coming. But let's dig into all of this, particularly the latest Putin threats. We got our chief White House correspondent sitting here with me, Kristen Welker. We got our chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, in Ukraine. We've also have Michael McFaul, the former U.S. ambassador to Russia and NBC News international analyst. And Evelyn Farkas is here. She's the executive director at the McCain Institute. More importantly, she served in the Defense Department. She was a former assistant secretary of defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. So first, let's talk about how much today changed, Kristen, based on what happened earlier this morning. The president was already going to address Putin in the war. It was going to be a big part of the speech. But then Putin seemed to announce his own recalibration, which we were all expecting. How much did the White House use this speech to react directly to that?
Well, they did react directly to it. They say they were prepared for this type of escalation, Chuck, but there's no doubt that the president did have to review and even rewrite at least a line of his speech to directly respond to what we heard from Vladimir Putin, which was an escalation. This mobilization of more than 300,000 troops. But the fact that he threatened to use nuclear weapons just days, to put this into context, after President Biden in an interview said there would be severe consequences if he were to use nuclear weapons. Now, the president has never said what those consequences will be, and of course has said that he's not going to send U.S. troops into Ukraine, and so big question mark looms over that. But this was a clear escalation, or an attempt at an escalation by Vladimir Putin, and I think it really underscores the fact that this is a president who feels as though his back is against the wall. Of course, Ukraine has had these gains, and so he is feeling defeated in some areas. And so he's really trying to recalibrate, Vladimir Putin is. And I think that it's worth noting this is a leader who is unpredictable, and that's one of the things that concerns U.S. officials most, Chuck.
In a perverse way, does the White House, I mean, the timing of this oddly is really good for this White House as they try to meet with various delegations here at the UN and get continued support for this war. Putin saber-rattling today almost feels like an advertisement for that.
It proves this point, right? I mean, his whole goal is to rally support for Ukraine. Now this war entering into its seventh month, and you have the U.S. It's already given more than $15 billion in military aid. The question becomes, when you're talking about some of these allies around the world, in Europe in particular, how does the president continue to keep them incentivized, to keep giving more military and economic and humanitarian aid against the backdrop of everything that you just laid out, Chuck, which is this impending financial crisis that they are bracing for the possibility of it worsening in Europe, potentially leading to a global recession, and of course the energy crisis as well. And so that's where the real challenge lies.
I have to say, Germany seemed very bullish on being able to handle this. Chancellor Scholz really feels like he's going to handle this, and he seems to be a bit more committed.
And the UK too.
Yeah.
But those are two
pledges,
of a number of allies.
Pledges
that
and reality can sometimes run into each other. All right, Richard Engel in Ukraine. What's been the response, and what do they want the Western alliance response? Again, as I say, we're in the middle of this gathering at the UN. Normally you're here. It's one of the few times we get to see you here in New York. You're not, because we're in the middle of this war. I know Zelensky's going to be speaking, and he's going to be making his pitch. What do they want in response to this saber-rattling?
They want the West, they want the United States not to lose their nerve. They want to keep going. They believe that they have the upper hand right now, that the Russian military is, at least on a tactical level, collapsing out here in the east, that the main defensive line in northeastern Ukraine, not far from where I am in Kharkiv, has effectively collapsed. And they don't want the United States, Germany, other countries to hear this nuclear saber rattling and suddenly get cold feet about the entire enterprise. They believe that right now the Russians are on the ropes. The Russians don't have enough men to keep the ranks moving, and that's been one of the big problems. That's why Putin has had to order this general or partial mobilization, because a lot of the units, they have many units, but they don't have enough manpower in the units. And in some of the battles here over the last couple of weeks, according to Ukrainian officials, the Russians, which have a larger military than the Ukrainians do, were outnumbered 8-1. And it's one of the reasons we've seen Russian security companies going to prisons and offering pardons to convicted criminals in exchange for combat tours. The Ukrainians feel that at this time, because it's going to take some time for the Russians to gather these 300,000 men and get them into service and get them some basic training, get them onto the battlefield, that they have an opportunity right now. And while this partial mobilization has been called, we're already getting a sense of how the Russian people are feeling about it, because many of them are mobilizing and are mobilizing towards the exits of the country. Earlier today, there were reports that flights out of Moscow to all visa-free countries to which Russians can travel without a visa, were all booked or were only available for exorbitant prices. Other reports that those flights were later restricted, of long lines of cars heading toward the Finnish border, which has an open visa policy. So there is a feeling in this country that by expanding this war and exposing the general public of Russia more to it, this could work in Ukraine's favor and against Putin in the short to medium term.
Richard, what's the Ukrainian government's plan to handle these sham referenda that obviously are designed to give Putin this rationale that somehow Russia's territorial integrity is being threatened?
Well, that's the main argument, and I think it's important to follow Vladimir Putin's rationale right now. So starting on Friday and then continuing into next week, there's supposed to be these 4 different referenda in 4 regions in Ukrainian territory, regions that are either partially or completely controlled by Russian forces. And it is widely expected that these elections, these referenda, yes-no vote, will decide to see those areas join up with Russia. And Vladimir Putin has already made it clear in his comments that he wants this process to go forward and that he wants these areas to become part of Russia. If you're reading between the lines a little bit, but that was the general framework. The next step would be, so the referenda take place, Vladimir Putin accepts them, they want to be part of Russia forever, and he says okay. And that was the context in which he was describing potential use of nuclear weapons, saying if the territorial integrity of Russia, meaning the future Russia, the pieces of Russia that are about to become incorporated to Russia are threatened, then he could draw out his nuclear weapons. So there are concerns here that he is setting the stage to create a nuclear crisis. Annex these territories, make them part of the country, territories that are still contested, still in a battle zone, and then roll out nuclear weapons in order to cause a kind of a Cuban Missile Crisis Part 2.
Well, there's a scenario. Richard Engel in Kharkiv for us. Richard, I know you've got a bunch of other reporting to do, and it's late. I'll let you go. Appreciate that. So it's with that scenario that Richard just painted, Mike McFall, that I want to ask you about this. Obviously, Putin is backed into a corner. He's been in a corner for 7 months. This is step 1 of his reaction here. He's clearly desperate to strengthen himself at a negotiating table. But how long does he have?
Great question, Chuck. I don't have a great answer. I think this speech was a speech of defeat, right? He wouldn't be given this speech if he's winning on the battlefield. And he's changed the goalposts in 2 ways. One, he now talks about liberating Donbass. He throws in 2 other regions, as you were just talking with Richard. He's a little confused about that. Sometimes it's the greater Novorossiya that he talks about. But he's very explicit. He's not taking over all of Ukraine. He wants to just liberate Donbass. And then 2, he has to mobilize 300,000 people to do that. Those are 2 very different things than he said 7 months ago. I think what the Ukrainian government is worried about, and I am worried about too, frankly, is that if somehow he does that, and then he says, okay, now let's sue for peace. You know, it's like the game of musical chairs. I'm sitting on these four new regions. Let's now sue for peace. And don't forget, with his saber rattling about his nuclear weapons to the West, if you don't, that's what I'm going to do. And then I think leaders in Kiev are worried that the West will say, well, peace is better than nuclear war. So that, I think, is the next thing that we should be watching for in the coming weeks and months.
Evelyn, how do we prepare for that? Chancellor, I asked basically a version of that question to Chancellor Scholz about, what's negotiable of Ukraine's territory. And he said it's up to Ukraine. I brought up Crimea, and he's like, it's up to Ukraine. That's the second world leader that is saying that. Is that what the alliance is going? Will they all stick together on that front?
Well, I mean, the best I can say is hopefully, Chuck. But I do think it's really important to pause and just kind of restate what both you and Mike McFaul just said. I mean, what President Putin is trying to do is start kind of a new negotiation on his terms. His declaration that he's going to hold these referenda and essentially annex these portions of Ukraine, these new portions of Ukraine. His declaration that he's going to do this call up of reservists. These are just statements. They're political statements. We don't even know if he has enough reservists, how fast he can train them. Does he have enough equipment for them? So I don't even know whether it's really militarily credible or how much teeth it has in the short term. In the short term, it's really aimed at his nationalist base, you know, making sure that they know he's with them. It's aimed at the people living in those separatist areas. But I think we need to understand that this nuclear saber rattling, it gets Putin nowhere. I mean, if you draw it to its logical conclusion and the Ukrainians attack Donbass, or we help them attack Donbass, and they detonate a nuclear device, I mean, the world has changed. And President Biden said it himself, and I've said it in other fora, you know, basically the international community will not stand to have a leader after the Second World War for the first time use a nuclear weapon, detonate a nuclear weapon in anger. That will change the equation. We will then probably have to take direct action. It doesn't mean boots on the ground, but we'll have to do something to get that person or that regime that authorized such a decision out of the Kremlin, out of power. So it's a game changer. And he has to see beyond that, right?
It's pretty clear right now that Russia's troops in Ukraine are very vulnerable. Is there how important of a moment is this? And do you sense that the Western Alliance and NATO realizes, hey, boy, now is the time to give Ukraine everything it needs, because clearly the Russians are vulnerable in this moment, more so than they might be if and when those 300,000 troops get drawn into this?
Yeah, I mean, you asked me the right question, because I'm constantly nervous, you know, having kind of grown up professionally in this defense world where you're always thinking of worst case scenario. Yesterday, I met with some Lithuanian defense officials, and they're worried that we're not providing enough fast enough, and also new weapons that they need now that things are changing. So I do think that there's a fear, and it's very hard to tell. Even they conceded we might be providing enough. The Ukrainians aren't telling us everything. But they think resupply is also an issue. You know, the tempo that they've been using these weapons. You know, we really do, though, need to take advantage of the time we have now. They also said they thought that we could fight, or the Ukrainians could fight into the winter, potentially. They're more worried about a rainy season. So, you know, the equation is fast action now while the Russians are weak. That's what we have to press with.
Mike, I'm curious to watch Russians flee the country, right? Trying to get out of military service, trying to get out of this. I mean, look, I know it's very hard to understand what's going on in the Kremlin, but this has to be, I mean, Putin he looks as weak as ever, and this feels like he's as vulnerable as ever, but I know that that doesn't mean he's vulnerable.
Well, you know, it's always hard to know when dictators are vulnerable, right? A professor at Harvard, when Nikita Khrushchev was thrown out in 1964, he was asked by somebody like you, probably, Chuck. He said, well, why didn't you predict that, Professor Ulam? And he said, how could I predict it when Khrushchev himself didn't know it? So just to remind ourselves, we're bad at understanding those things. Yeah. Having said that, yes, tickets to Istanbul are $1,200 today. For the first time in months, you had hundreds, maybe thousands of people out on the streets in Moscow protesting against the war. If they're doing that, that means that orders of magnitude of others have the same preferences. Nobody wants to be called up in a partial mobilization. And this was a thing that Putin wanted to avoid. The fact that he had to do it means that he's desperate, that he wants to change the equation on the battlefield. And I just completely agree with what Evelyn said. I just think this is a moment for the Ukrainians. They've known it for a long time, by the way. These counteroffensive have been planned for a long time. They wanted it right before the UN General Assembly so that they could refuel and re-spark support from the West. They now are, you know, if you look at their soldiers, they all have, you know, first Kherson, then Crimea, all those kind of signs. They want to march now because they don't want to freeze into that moment where if Putin signals negotiation, he might have some supporters in the West. I don't think President Biden, but maybe some other leaders might say, hey, it's time to call it quits.
Kristen, does the White House appreciate the urgency of this moment?
They absolutely do. And I think it speaks to the fact that they know that there is a morale issue that Putin is dealing with right now. And so now is the time, they believe, to give President Zelensky what he's asking for. And I expect we're going to hear him lay that out when he speaks a little bit later on this hour. And they also go to a point that Evelyn was making, which is the timing of this. They just don't know what type of a timeline they are dealing with. And so they see this moment as critical, and they feel the urgency to get Zelensky what he needs. But again, he continues to say he needs more.
He does, and you can't help. You feel like there's a tiny crack sometimes in the Western Alliance that gets people nervous. Anyway, Kristen Welker, Ambassador McFaul, Mike, good to see you. Evelyn Farkas, good to see you as well. And, of course, Richard Engel in Kharkiv for us. Coming up, New York's Attorney General goes after Donald Trump with a sweeping $250 million civil lawsuit. What it means for the former president, his family, and his organization. And why could she not file state charges? Plus, the mission to prevent another January 6th and protect the integrity of the next presidential election. You're looking at the House floor right now. It is voting on the House version of this bill to overhaul how we count electoral votes in this country. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. We're turning now to the latest legal developments surrounding former President Donald Trump, and you do need a scorecard to keep up with which lawsuit and which investigation we're talking about. This one is New York State and involves the Trump Organization. New York Attorney General Letitia James filed a civil lawsuit today against the former president and members of his family. She's alleging a years-long scheme to fraudulently inflate their wealth to essentially cheat the system on taxes and on financing.
Mr. Trump and the Trump Organization repeatedly and persistently manipulated the value of assets to induce banks to lend money to the Trump Organization on more favorable terms than would otherwise have been available to the company, to pay lower taxes, to satisfy continuing loan agreements, and to induce insurance companies to provide insurance coverage for higher limits and at lower premiums.
In a statement responding to the suit, Trump's attorney said, quote, "Today's filing is neither focused on the facts nor the law. Rather, it is solely focused on advancing the Attorney General's political agenda." So to be clear, this is a civil suit. Attorney General James said her investigation had also uncovered evidence that criminal laws may have been broken, even though her office did not bring criminal charges. We'll explain that in a few minutes. She's referred this matter to federal prosecutors at the Southern District of New York, as well as to folks at the IRS. Both entities have declined to comment. So I'm joined now by NBC News' investigations correspondent, Tom Winter, and I've also got defense attorney and NBC News legal analyst, Danny Savalas here. So, Tom, let's lay this out. She files this civil lawsuit. So in some ways, this is about defrauding the state and city.
Correct.
Of tax money, okay?
Correct.
So I guess my first question is there not a criminal statute in the state code that she could have charged Trump and the Trump Organization with?
Well, there is. I mean, from a criminal perspective, most criminal charges have to be brought by a district attorney. The attorney general in the state of New York, and each attorney general, depending upon the state, is different, is typically more of an office that files civil action. So one, this fits more in her purview. But two, to your point, when you bring the type of criminal charges that you might need to bring here, you have to establish intent in all sorts of other different things at the criminal level to meet the criminal bar, which is higher than a civil suit, of course. And so I think there's a calculus that maybe this was the best path forward based on the information that they found. Also, the best path forward when you consider the Attorney General of New York, Letitia James, you, me, anybody else, that what is the best lane for them to be in on this type of case. And this appears to be the best lane for them to be in on this type of case. And of course, this office, not led by James, but led by others, has had other civil suits against Trump, his foundation, the university in the past. They've had settlements in those instances. So I think you've seen an office that at least has done this dance before.
Let me ask you this. There is Alvin Bragg, who is the DA in Manhattan,
correct,
New York City. he came out and after her announcement said, hey, we're still investigating a potential crime here.
Right.
They still have a criminal investigation going on. If that was the case, why wouldn't she wait to see where that goes?
It is true that he still has an ongoing criminal investigation. We've seen no signs of any sort of investigative efforts for the last 6 months, and I asked him about that.
Interesting.
And I asked him about that after the Alan Weissel guilty plea. Now, we had heard continuously in a prior office just from people that have been brought before the grand jury themselves. I mean, their own attorneys would put out public statements. So I'm not giving up any sources here. If an attorney says, yeah, I put my client before the grand jury, and they were asked questions about X, Y, and Z, well, that's an on-the-record statement. So we knew about steps that were being taken. Then we have not heard about any steps that have been taken since the early part of this year. There's no grand jury that we're aware of that's listening to any sort of evidence. So I think they don't want to necessarily close out this case when they still have Alan Weisselberg yet to testify against the Trump organization. He still has to report to prison. Rikers is a terrible place to be when it's running well. It's not running well now. He's going to be there during the winter time. I don't think he wants to quite close the book and put it away in the deep filing cabinet just yet. On the other hand, I think for the AG's office, they had already taken Trump's deposition. That was really the end of it. Think of like the Hillary Clinton investigation, the email server investigation. The FBI got her statement at that point. Shortly thereafter, they knew what they had or what they didn't have. And so I think this was the natural ending point.
Danny Savalas, how strong is the civil case?
It's strong, and here's why. Number one, there are going to be a lot of receipts. In other words, there's going to be a lot of evidence because this is a document-heavy case. In other words, when Trump et al. Represented to banks and insurers that they had X amount in assets, that's going to be on a piece of paper. Now, on the Trump side, their defense will surely be two-pronged. Number one, this is all political, but that isn't really a defense in court. So the real defense in court is going to be, look, valuation of property is subjective. And by the way, it's especially subjective when Trump is involved because Trump will argue that just putting his name in big coming attraction marquee letters on the front of a building can change the valuation of a building. That's a defense that is interesting in most cases, but in this case, at least according to the allegations in the complaint, multiplying valuation by tens, dozens of times, or taking 10,000 square feet of an apartment and saying it's 30,000 square feet, these numbers are dizzying to the average juror, even though at its core, this is a basic, I inflated my value to get more favorable terms on a loan or insurance.
Isn't it worse than that, though? He inflates it when he wants it inflated, and then they deflate it when they want it. I mean, isn't that where this becomes almost open and shut? If he were always inflating, then the Trump branding argument makes sense to me. But then explain the deflation.
If true, this scheme is really one of the oldest schemes in the book. You inflate your value when you want to impress and ruffle your feathers for the mortgage companies and the people who want to give you money so you show you're not a risk. But, Chuck, when the tax man cometh, oh, we have no money in our coffers. It's going to be a cold winter. This has been going on since business, since the tax code started. It just doesn't go on at this level. And while the numbers, the millions and billions of dollars and the thousands of square feet may be dizzying to the average person, at their core, Letitia James is counting on a jury that's going to get this case at its core. They may not have tens of thousands of square feet in their New York studio apartment, but they're going to get the idea that we've all, to those people who have applied for a mortgage, we all would love to show the mortgage company that we have a lot more money than we do, but we can't do it because it's illegal.
Tom, the referral of the SDNY.
Right.
Some of these things, is there a statute of limitations on some of these criminal charges? Because I remember there was some thought that there might be on the criminal front.
Right. So one of the things that's contained in today's filings is that some of the things that you've just been talking about with Danny, the inflation or underinflation, have been going on up until 2020 when Trump was under investigation, when he knew he was under investigation.
So this would mean Eric and Jr., or maybe they might be the ones in more criminal more in the criminal line of fire here, right?
Potentially, and I think that's a really smart point. So, yeah, from a statute of limitations concern, certainly 5 years could be the case. But then when you bring in conspiracy, which is essentially what James has done here today, she's not just going for the last couple of years. She's gone back 10 years and looking at this. I think that's a potential avenue for federal prosecutors to get around that issue.
Would you be surprised if SDNY took a pass on this one? This feels like this is in their wheelhouse. They love these financial cases.
I don't think there's any chance they take a pass at it. Whether or not they think that it rises to the bar, and there's obviously a ton of evidence, even though it's a 220-page filing, there's a lot of evidence we're not yet seeing. They're going to definitely need to look at this, where that goes from there.
You assume they open a case, whether they end up indictments filing, that's a long way away, but they will open a case.
100%. I don't see there's a way out of that.
Tom Winter, Danny Savalos. Another day, again, you got to get your scorecard. Which investigation are we talking about? This one is Trump org and New York. We will be talking about the other ones a bit later. Thank you both. But before we go, in our First Read newsletter today, we put together 12 numbers that help explain the 2022 primary season. Here's one of them, 219. That's at least how many House Republican nominees have publicly questioned or cast doubt on the legitimacy of President Biden's election. 219. And folks, here's the kicker. 38 of them might win their seat in Congress, because 38 of these election deniers are running in very competitive races. It's a number that arguably puts an even bigger spotlight on efforts in Congress right now to pass legislation to help safeguard the presidential elections that are coming up. We'll take you to Capitol Hill next. And you can catch even more analysis of the upcoming midterm elections on today's episodes of the Chuck Todd Cast. We feature two top political editors, my colleague Mark Murray and the Cook Political Report's Jessica Taylor. We break down the big 11 Senate races. Get it wherever you get your podcast. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. We are right now, and unless you're watching this on demand, right now the House of Representatives is voting on a bill that would overhaul the Electoral Count Act. That is the 19th century law that President Trump and his supporters attempted to exploit on January 6th, and that attempt to overturn the presidential election of 2020. The bill was proposed by two members of the January 6th committee, California Democrat Zoe Lofgren and Wyoming Republican Liz Cheney. The bill, if passed and enacted, would raise the threshold for objecting to state electors from one member to a third of each congressional chamber. By the way, the Senate bill would make it a fifth of each chamber, for what it's worth. This House bill would also require governors to send their elector slates to Congress before Election Day, so they know who these people are. It would also create a formal process to hear candidate concerns about a state's election results. And perhaps above all, it would clarify that the vice president's role in counting votes is purely ministerial, pure and simple. Despite, or perhaps because of Cheney's support, House Republicans are whipping against the bill. It's a bizarre excuse that simply because Liz Cheney is proposing the idea that somehow some people can't vote for it. Ali Vitale is on Capitol Hill right now, and I know we're in the middle of this, so again, apologies to our folks that are watching this on demand. But where are we? It's pretty close, and not many Republicans are on this bill, are they?
Not many Republicans are on this bill. We have, a little pool going on if it's going to be more or less than 5, because many Republicans who could vote for it have been pretty mum on whether or not they're going to. And again, you're right that most Republicans are whipping against this. And the reasoning that they're giving on the floor for why they're voting no is basically a process argument. How fast this bill has gone through the Rules Committee and now to the floor. So they're not even arguing on the substance of it. And in large part, it's because it is in so many ways a direct response to what happened here on January 6th, when you see the thresholds being raised to object to a count, clarifying the role of a vice president. All of this is in direct reaction to the things that former President Trump did on January 6th and in the lead up to that. But the 4 Republicans, too, tell a story of what the GOP conference looks like right now. According to what I'm looking at, it's Liz Cheney, no surprise, she's a co-sponsor, Adam Kinzinger, the other Republican member of the January 6th committee, Peter Meyer, and Tom Rice, and all 4 of those members are not returning to Congress next year because they lost their primaries. So that really does tell the story here.
Yeah. I just put on screen, Ali, while you were talking, the Senate's version of the bill and their electoral count sponsors. There's 10 Ds and 10 Rs. There's more Senate Republican sponsors right now than there are House Republican votes, at least in the moment that we're sitting here. But I've noticed people like Don Bacon, right, who represents that Biden district in Nebraska that went Biden and he won his reelection. I think he said he likes the Senate bill and he's not for this bill. Are we going to see a lot of those statements from those swing district Republicans that want to be for something, just not for this?
Yeah, that's what we're going to be looking for, because what the House does here, the Senate will then have to react to. And you're right that there are differences between the bill versions in terms of what that threshold is. It's a third here in the House, a fifth in the Senate. The difference with the Senate bill, and people who I've talked to have been involved in these negotiations say that they're still confident that it's going to get over the finish line. They're not going to let something like a numerical threshold be the thing that derails what was months of work in the Senate. But nevertheless, it's going to be interesting to see the excuses that some of these Republicans come up with and how they ultimately get to passing this between the House and the Senate, reconciling these two different bills.
I have to tell you, remember, it was a process argument many Republicans made on not trying to hold Donald Trump accountable. These process arguments seem to pop up when there are votes against Donald Trump that potentially have to be cast. Anyway, Ali Vitale on Capitol Hill for us. Ali, thank you. Up next, the latest move by the Federal Reserve to tame inflation and what it could mean for the economy and the midterms. And another number from today's First Read newsletter that helps explain the 2022 primary season. 259. That's how many women won their House primaries, 82 Republicans and 177 Democrats. That is more than double the current number of women serving in the House right now. More to come after a short break. Welcome back. In June, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell called a 0.75% interest rate hike unusually large and not expected to be common. Today, he announced the central bank's third straight rate hike of that magnitude. So I guess we have to call it common now. The move comes as inflation continues to rise, with consumer prices stubbornly going up in August despite the Fed's action and despite falling gas prices. And while speaking with reporters today, Powell acknowledged the very real risk that the Fed's efforts to tame inflation are going to have to lead to a recession, saying, quote, "No one knows whether this process will lead to a recession, or if so, how significant that recession would be." Sounds like somebody who's not interested in stopping out of fear of a recession if it means we can lower and tame inflation. Joining me now for some insight on what Powell's move could mean for the economy is the founder of Inflation Insights, Omer Sharif. Mr. Sharif, it is good to see you. Thank you for coming in. Let me start with, when is there a moment where the Fed says, let's take a quarter off and see what happens, rather than it says, let's keep pressing the gas and see what happens?
Yeah, I think that's still probably a couple of quarters away. If you look at what the Fed indicated today, they put out a new set of projections for where they expect interest rates to go. And what it shows you is that we are still looking at about another 1.25 to 1.5 percentage points of interest rate increases, probably over the next, I would say, 6 months. So, they want to get to a point where they think interest rates are at a restrictive level that are enough to bring growth down and bring the labor market, as they like to say, into better balance between supply and demand. But that looks like it's still at least a couple of quarters away, and then they will sit there and assess how things are going.
Look, I want to actually focus on the labor market issue here a minute. Our labor market's problem is we probably need a lot more immigration. Our labor market, I guess here's the concern, Omer, is that they tame it, they do everything they can to sort of shake up the labor market. We see rising unemployment. Then we do have a bunch of new workers jumping into the workforce. And then all of a sudden we have all of these other issues. If we entered more people into the workforce now, maybe we could tame wages without creating this unemployment shock.
Yeah, look, I don't disagree with you. Quite honestly, I think the Fed would love to see the labor supply increase, whether it's through increased immigration or more people jumping back into the workforce. I think they would be ecstatic if labor supply increased, because that would end up putting a little bit less pressure on wage growth. It would put a little bit less pressure on inflation. And I don't think they would raise interest rates, obviously, as high as they expect to do so today. But that's just something. Labor supply is not something the Fed controls. They can really only affect the demand side of things. And if you look today, they expect the unemployment rate to rise from 3.7% today to 4.4% next year. And just to put that briefly into context, if that were to happen, let's say tomorrow, you're talking about roughly 1.2 million more people who would be unemployed if they end up moving the unemployment rate up to 4.4%.
Okay, but correct me if I'm wrong. I grew up being told that 5% unemployment was essentially full employment.
Yeah, that is, that is a moving target as we've seen over time. I mean, it used to be actually 6.5%. It moved down to 5%. There's an argument that it lowered, it went even lower to around 4%. I mean, we had an economy, don't forget, in 2018, 2019, where the unemployment rate was well below 5% without inflation. And so the thought was, you know what, this equilibrium unemployment rate is probably lower than 5%. And so we've been kind of waiting to get back to that. We have been at 3.5%, but obviously now inflation has skyrocketed. And they think that it might be a bit higher now, perhaps a little bit higher than the 4% figure that most people think about.
Let me ask you this. The one other part that the Fed does that we don't focus as much energy on is essentially unwinding all of that, essentially all of that money they printed. Where does that stand and how much, what's the balance there between interest rate hikes and them sort of, slowly shrinking the money supply?
Right. Yeah. Look, the short answer is nobody really knows. This is we're talking about $2 trillion in reserves that they are going to scoop up over the course of probably roughly the next year and a half. Nobody really understands exactly how that dynamic will play out in terms of, what is that worth in terms of tighter financial conditions? What is it worth in terms of putting it in terms of interest rate hikes? There was actually a recent Fed paper that came out that suggested it's worth anywhere between only about 1/4 of a rate hike to almost 3/4 of a percentage point. And it's just something they're going to have to monitor as they increase rate hikes alongside it. Their hope is that because they've laid out a path, it's very steady over the course of the next year, that it really won't have a big impact because everyone understands exactly how much they're rolling off every single month.
Omer Sharif, who is becoming our inflation and Fed Reserve soothsayer these days. Really appreciate you coming on and sharing your expertise and perspective. We'll have much more ahead, including a look at the looming energy crisis in Europe and the potential fallout here, especially if it's ahead of the midterms. And as we go to break, let me show you one more number from today's First Read newsletter that helps explain the 2022 primary season. 76. That's how many House nominees are running for Congress for the very first time. And keep track of those 76. Quite a few of them might look appealing to voters who are looking for non-professional politicians. By the way, subscribe to First Read for more of these key stats and all of the day's top political stories and takes sent straight to your inbox every morning. It is wisdom before it becomes conventional. Just scan the QR code on your screen right now. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. European countries are scrambling to address supply issues ahead of a looming energy crisis this winter as Vladimir Putin cuts off the continent's natural gas supply amid the war in Ukraine. And yesterday, the government of Germany, Europe's biggest economy, announced it was nationalizing one of its main importers of Russian gas in an effort to secure that country's energy supply. And in my exclusive interview today with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, he told me his country is taking other steps to prevent an energy crisis from spiraling out of control.
We increased the influx of gas from the Western European ports in Netherlands, in Belgium, and newly in France. We organized that they increase their capacities, and we buy more gas from Norway and the Netherlands, who are producing gas. And we decided to fill our storages. We are now above 90%. Which is completely different to 1 year ago, where we would not have been able to face a situation like this. We decided to bring back coal plants to produce electricity for not using gas for doing so. We decided to make it easy for companies to do the fuel switch so that they can go from gas to oil or coal with legislative support. And we decided that the 2 nuclear plants in the south of Germany could continue to produce electricity in January, February, March, if necessary. And if we look at all these decisions, I could say to you now and to the public in Germany, completely different to 1 year ago, we will be able to face this winter, although Russia is not delivering gas through Nord Stream 1 pipeline and to Germany and some other countries in Europe. And many others took similar decisions in Europe. So this question of supply is, as it looks like, solved.
He also said he did not think he would have to ration. Joining me now is Jason Bordoff. He's the co-founding dean of the Columbia Climate School, and he's the founding director of the Centurion Global Energy Policy. All right, you heard everything he said there. And I want to start with his pledge, and it was it was literally my next follow-up was about the rationing issue. He feels as if they're in a position where they won't have to do that. Yeah. You heard his rationale, is he right?
Could well be right. I mean, it's so weather dependent. Natural gas depends on the heat and how cold it is. And so right now they have pretty flush inventories. And if the weather is moderate, they can get through most of the winter. And then if there's no other problems in the system, you know, they will make it through the winter. But bearing in mind that demand is going to come down 10 or 15%, not because of a managed plan, but because prices are so high. Right. When prices are really high, you start shutting down industry and people use less. So that's pretty painful economically. It's part of the reason Europe may be headed into a recession.
Explain how this still could impact us. And I'm just curious, when, you know, timing is everything, particularly in American politics. You know, take our friends in New Hampshire, who have a lot of people in New England deal with heating oil in order to heat their homes. When are they going to get hit with this? Or will they? Or have we somehow buffeted this from them getting hit?
Well, the country as a whole is more buffeted. We are pretty flush with our own resources. We're not connected with natural gas the same way we are with oil to an international market. New England's the exception. New England still imports liquefied natural gas by tankers. And so the price in Europe, when that goes up, that does affect people in New England, and that could be pretty painful. We are seeing gasoline prices come down, but obviously Putin has not yet weaponized oil. He might. And we saw the escalation today with what he did with annexing of territories and all the rest. So we don't know if that's where things are headed. But he's weaponized gas. If he goes for oil next, that's going to cause pain for everyone who uses oil all around the world.
One thing the German Chancellor said that he could use from the United States was more gas.
You know,
can we export it?
We can't export more. We can export to different places, and we're already doing that. Not because the government has decided that. It's just how markets work.
Sure.
So prices for natural gas in Europe have gone up so much that a tanker coming out of the Gulf Coast finds it more economic, profitable to go to Europe rather than Asia. That's hard for other parts of the world that we're depending on that gas. So the price of coal is going through the roof, and if high coal prices, high gas prices, that's painful in Asia. And if you're a low-income country, emerging markets, Pakistan, Bangladesh, they can barely afford any energy at all.
The vulnerability of this market to trigger, basically, it feels like we're on the brink of a global recession. The smart people may tell us we're already there. But you look at these energy markets, the likelihood we have a winter catastrophe that triggers a global recession.
Well, it's going to be most acute in Europe for sure, because again, natural gas is pretty disconnected. The price of natural gas in Europe is about 7 times what it is in the United States. So energy is helping a little bit with inflation now in the U.S., although the inflation numbers still don't look great. But if you look at other parts of the world, energy is going to be a big problem.
One of the other things the Chancellor told me, we need more people pumping oil, and which really means OPEC. And this is where, as you said, he could weaponize gas. It's clear that OPEC is not playing a helpful role here, are they?
Well, there's not that much more they can do. So if you look at how much spare capacity, the amount of production, OPEC, mostly Saudi Arabia, that's the country with most of the ability to quickly ramp up oil production. They're producing near record levels. So they could probably produce a little bit more, but not a huge amount. And the other country that can increase production pretty quickly is now the United States. Right. That's a game changer. And we are increasing production, but not as much as people thought or would have been the case several years ago.
I want to end with the president's speech to the UN, because he spent a lot of time talking about the climate initiatives, and it actually dovetails with a great piece you wrote for Foreign Policy about how the next step here in climate policy in the United States is being really good at diplomacy. Explain.
Yeah, we passed this historic piece of legislation, $400 billion for climate. I mean, it's a game changer in the U.S. And I think the point I was trying to make was if we want it to be as much of a game changer as it can be, we also need tools of foreign policy and diplomacy. The U.S. is 11% of emissions. The emissions growth is not coming from the United States. It's coming from other parts of the world. So we need to drive down the cost of technology, clean energy, and then make that available to other parts of the world, make sure they have the tools to finance it, because we need trillions of dollars of capital to go into this.
It was interesting to me. This is the first time an American president actually talked about climate and said, hey, we've made our investment. Now what about you? Do you expect this to trigger some more international investment in climate mitigation?
Well, I think so. I think having the U.S. back at the table coming up to the UN climate meetings in November in Egypt is a real game changer. It gives us more credibility. It does build a little bit of resentment in some developing economies, too, when they see, we're rushing to send more natural gas to Europe, but not to them. But I think everyone realizes we're in a climate crisis, and they're stepping up as much as they can. It's just not everybody can spend as much money as we can. Jason Bordoff from the Columbia Climate School. Thank you. Good to see you. Thank you.
And thank you all for being with us this hour. I'll be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.